It's 5:05 and welcome into the Carolina Journal News Hour on Charlotte's FM News Talk, 107.9 FM, WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Tuesday morning to you. Some pretty big political news to kick off 2026 across North Carolina. For the first time ever in state history, there are now more registered Republicans than Democrats. To walk us through some of those details this morning, Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Andy, for folks that read your work over at the John Locke Foundation, maybe they follow you on social media, this is something that is not out of the blue. You and many other folks have been projecting and predicting that this would happen in either late 2025 or early 2026. It's officially happened. What do you make of it?
Well, yeah, this did seem to be inevitable. I've been basically doing kind of a countdown, a watch, projecting how when this was going to happen. I don't think anybody doubted that it was going to happen. It's just a question of when. And this has been, an ongoing trend, really stretching back to the 1960s, but it took off during the Reagan administration, the 80s. And then, Republican numbers as a percentage wise kind of stayed flat over the last couple of decades, but Democrats continued to plunge. And so this was inevitable, and we knew this was going to happen. The question is, what kind of impact will this have on the state going forward? That is a bit of an open question because unaffiliated voters are such a black box.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that. We go back to 2010. Republicans take control of the North Carolina General Assembly, both chambers, for the first time in nearly 130 years, I think is the number off the top of my head. And since that period of time, Andy, we've seen the Republican majority grow and shrink in the General Assembly back and forth. However, the GOP does still hold a majority in both chambers. But you bring up that a very interesting point. While there are more Republicans than Democrats, there's more unaffiliateds than both. And I think that puts the state of North Carolina in a very interesting position, especially as we move into an election later on this year.
It is. And, we have to remember that a lot of this transition has been kind of generational, and that also includes some of what we call in the old days the Jesse-crats. These are relatively conservative Democrats who often would vote across the aisle for Republicans. A lot of those folks are now gone, and they've been replaced by registered Republicans that vote Republicans. So in a certain sense, the electorate has only changed a little bit, even though the party registration relative to each other has changed a lot. With unaffiliateds, it's hard to predict. Now, there's a relatively small portion of those unaffiliateds that are really independent. Most of them are kind of soft partisans one way or another. If you look, and these are all public records, if you were to look up somebody's unaffiliated person's voter registration records and see how they voted, like which primary they vote in, most unaffiliateds will pick one or the other. There are very few kind of true switch hitters who will, well, I feel like voting in the Republican primary this year. And that generally is reflected in general election turnouts. We actually having less switch voting, less ticket splitting now than we did, say, 20 years ago. If you look, the difference between the most Republican race and the most Democratic race, with the exception of this last time around, because the governor's race was a little unusual, is actually shrinking. There was a time where you would have the gap between what happened in the president's race and the governor's race would be like 20 points. And now if it's, a 12-point difference, that's a big deal. And so it's strange. We have less ticket splitting, but as a whole, unaffiliateds are a little less predictable than either Republicans or Democrats.
And Andy, you mentioned the process that many unaffiliated voters will play out here in the coming weeks and months. Early voting starts February 12th. Primary election day rolls around March the 3rd of this year. We have a semi-closed, or some people call it a semi-open primary here in North Carolina. If you're a Republican, you vote in the Republican primary. If you're a Democrat, you vote in the Democrat primary. However, if you're an unaffiliated voter, you get to pick which one, not both, but one or the other to vote in. That's something that's changed in state law over the last couple of years. It's now mandated, but there are folks on both sides of the aisle, Andy, that argue we don't want these unaffiliated voters in our primary choosing our candidates.
Yeah, and that has been an argument. The reason that the parties adopted this once it became an option, Republicans did it first and then Democrats a few years later back in the 90s, was the belief that if you let these unaffiliated, and they were already a growing segment of the registrant, then if you let them in your process to vote in the primaries, then they become attached to the candidates and they're more likely to vote for your side in the fall. So that's the argument, at least. The issue now is you have groups, and this seems to be a little more organized on the Democratic side, where they're trying to get their folks, or at least people on the left, trying to get their people involved in Republican primary politics. We've seen several issues of this, of where you have people, if you look at the registrations again, there are people that have been voting in Democratic primaries for years, and now they're registered as Republicans and running against Republican incumbents in several primaries here in North Carolina. The Democrats tried that against Madison Cawthorn in 2022. It didn't really work out for them because they were supporting a long shot candidate. Cawthorn lost, but not because of those crossover voters. But this is something that's ever present now, and this is a reason that some of the party stalwarts would really like to go back to a closed primary so that only registered Republicans or registered Democrats can affect the nomination in their party contest.
Andy, as I understand it, some provisions in Senate Bill 747, which was a pretty wide-sweeping election bill that passed the General Assembly a couple of years ago, the only way that the parties could do that at this point would be to have the General Assembly change the state law. Is that how you understand it?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. I don't really know the motivation behind the legislators that wanted that. I think maybe it's kind of like, Cortez landed in Mexico and burnt all the boats. They're telling people, we're not going back. We're going to have these semi-open primaries. You're just going to have to get used to it. And so I don't expect this is going to change. This is the world that we live in North Carolina, where it really doesn't make a lot of sense unless you plan on running for office to register with one party or another. There's no real benefit to it. You just lose some flexibility when it comes time to voting in the primary. And we have this kind of social tendency. This is a broader social phenomenon in America. People are not associating with organizations. The Knights of Columbus are shrinking. People are bowling alone, to use the book for Robert Putnam. And it's the same way with the parties. People don't want to affiliate with the party. There are some people who believe that you could potentially anger an employer or a business associate if they find out you're registered with the wrong party. And so it's a safer bet for folks to go ahead and register unaffiliated. And there's no upside really for most of us to register with a party.
More with Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:13 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Charlotte's FM News Talk 107.9 WBT. We'll head over to the traffic center, get a look at the roadways on your early Tuesday morning commute with Boomer Von Cannon.
All right, Nick. Thank you, sir. And good. You are live.
It's 5:19. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on Charlotte's FM News Talk 107.9 FM WBT. The John Locke Foundation's Carolina Liberty Conference is coming to the Starview Hotel in Raleigh, February 27th and 28th. We'd love to see you there. The Carolina Liberty Conference brings together policymakers, scholars, community leaders, and citizens from across the state of North Carolina to explore the challenges and opportunities of advancing freedom in today's political and cultural climate. This year, like many other organizations, we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution with amazing guest speakers like Chief Justice Paul Newby. He's the head of the North Carolina Supreme Court, State Auditor Dave Bolick, and more. You can register today for the 2026 Carolina Liberty Conference by visiting our website, johnlocke.org. That's johnlocke.org, johnlocke.org. Takes place February the 27th through 28th at the Starview Hotel in Raleigh. Can't wait to see you for the 2026 Carolina Liberty Conference. We're joined this morning by Dr. Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation talking about a pretty significant story in North Carolina politics. For the first time ever in state history, there are now officially more Republicans than Democrats registered across the Tar Heel state. Andy, when we look at this unaffiliated voter block, this does create some problems, however, for the parties and for the candidates, because you don't necessarily know whether you are going after a true Republican or true Democrat voter that's unaffiliated. As you noted, yes, you can pull up these individuals' voting records. It's all public information in North Carolina and see, but you could potentially be talking about doing that for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of voters, depending on the election that you're running for. There are things like propensity and affinity scores if you've got access to data systems to look at voters, but that's not the case for most smaller candidates. For example, a county commission or a school board race taking place in all 100 counties across North Carolina. That adds an interesting complexion to local elections from my vantage point.
Yeah, it definitely makes things harder. Now, when you get in the general election, you should at least in theory have access to your party's databases, which would incorporate that data. But it's not just the fact that you may not have access to it, but if you get access to it, if you're a smaller campaign, what are you going to do with that kind of data? You're busy knocking on doors, and you don't have, maybe people on your campaign who know how to operate those kind of things. There's limits to what the local party can do to support their people. So this is more complex. And this is one of the ways where, as now Republicans start to expand their registration advantage, they may have an easier time in future elections. If they have a larger pool of people that they can reasonably expect will vote their way, if you just get them to the polls, at least initially, that's going to be an advantage for Republicans because they know who their people are. They don't have to go through all this, data work to try to figure out which unaffiliateds are their unaffiliateds or go the other way. And plus, right now, Republicans have a higher turnout than Democrats, and both of those have a higher turnout than unaffiliated. And so if you are depending on unaffiliateds to save you, that's a risky proposition compared to having, people that are your partisans and you know who they are. You just got to get them out.
Andy, you just kind of keyed off my next question here. You mentioned if Republicans are able to maintain this advantage and grow on it. Is that something that you would suspect would continue to happen here across North Carolina, as we talked about at the open here? So this is something that you and many others in the North Carolina political sphere have been watching and predicting for quite some time. Do things continue on this track? Do Democrats start seeing an uptick now that this news is out? Where do you lay it out there?
Yeah, I expect that the Republican advantage will continue. The Democrats generally, and the stereotype is generally true here, Democrats depend on younger voters. Younger voters are more likely to register as unaffiliated. And so once again, they're having to put that kind of unsteady ballast in their vote. And so I'm expecting Republicans will continue to grow their advantage as far as registrations go. And it's just going to make it easier for them on the get out the vote effort. But the flip side of this, though, is that it could change. There could be events. There was a steady growth of Republicans for a couple of decades. And during the Barack Obama campaign, you saw this large rush of new Democratic registrations in 2008. And so events could take over, things could change. But at least under current situation, for the foreseeable future, I'm expecting the Republican advantage to continue to grow. One interesting thing is we do have these pre-registrations that are starting to come online over the next few weeks. These are teenagers who had registered, and as long as they turn 18 before the general election, they're allowed to vote. Now, I happened to vote my first election when I was 17 in the 1986 Republican primary. I'm dating myself there a little bit, but you can do that in North Carolina. We will have 17-year-olds voting in this primary, perfectly legal as long as you turn 18 before the general election. Now, will this save the Democrats when we see like a little mini flip before it goes back? That's an interesting question because presumably younger people are a little more likely to vote Democratic. So we might see a mini flip back, but it's going to revert to norm. And I expect probably for years to come, Republicans will grow that advantage.
And you talk about these younger voters, and Andy, this has been something that a lot of data analysts and political scientists have been really watching over the last 10 or 15 years or so, is the shift in some of those younger voters. And it's almost, you can look at it almost based on where individuals live and kind of where they grew up. You've got pockets where the youth is way more conservative than generations past. In other parts of the country and in other areas, seeing almost the complete polar opposite. So to see these individuals involved and getting them in this political process is especially going to be interesting to see as we head into, what are traditionally, unfortunately, very low turnout elections like primaries that we'll likely see coming up here in March. Obviously, the general will have a much larger race at the top of the ticket, a Senate race with the former Democrat governor and Roy Cooper on it. So turnout probably will be a little bit higher, but the primary turnout numbers typically are always abysmal across North Carolina.
Yeah, you're really looking around the 20 percentile, maybe up to 40, depends on if you have a really, really exciting race. So yeah, it's going to be low. Now, Gen Z is less, and Gen Alpha when they come online, is considerably less progressive than the millennials. And if you look at just male voters, Gen Z tends to be a little more conservative. And so there are those kind of generational fluctuations, though, that to kind of buck that overall trend of younger people being more progressive, older people, as you get different life experiences, more conservative. But that generally holds true. So if we get this new generation, this Gen Z, and they're pretty moderate. I mean, they're once again closer to Republicans than millennials were, and then they go through those life experiences, start paying taxes, having children, those kind of things that tend to make people more conservative over their lifetime. As they start experiencing that, you potentially have the most conservative generation since at least Gen X, and maybe going back even further.
There's obviously going to be a lot to watch here in North Carolina. We'll keep an eye on all of these elections as they come forward. Andy's got some really great stuff that you can read over on our website this morning, johnlocke.org. We appreciate the information and insight this morning. Dr. Andy Jackson joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:27 on Charlotte's FM News Talk, 107.9 FM, WBT. We will head back to the traffic center. Another check on the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good morning. We have it.
It's 5:34. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on Charlotte's FM News Talk, 107.9 FM, WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Tuesday morning to you. If you have not lived in the state of North Carolina for the last 20 years, you might not be familiar with the North Carolina Education's Lottery's beginning, which actually only happened in between 2005 and 2006. It baked right into the name, the North Carolina Education Lottery. We've got a new report that we're tracking this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour out from the state auditor's office that shows that while lottery earnings have gone up, there's been a stagnation in relation to how much money is going towards the public education system here in North Carolina. To walk us through some of those details this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome the president and CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Donald Bryson, to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning. Donald, again, it's baked right into the name. This report out from the auditor's office should be concerning for everybody across the state.
I think it should be, and thanks for having me on, Nick. It's always fun to be on with this audience. The North Carolina Education Lottery is only 20 years old, passed in 2005 with the help of a tie vote in the state Senate. A lot of controversy still around that vote for people that were here at the time. And then Lieutenant Governor Beverly Perdue cast the tie-breaking vote to make the North Carolina Education Lottery law. And it was sold to taxpayers and to lawmakers as a way to increase revenue for public education in North Carolina. And it has done that. It has put money into public education in North Carolina. What the auditor's report shows is that as lottery revenues have increased over time, the percentage of money that is actually going back to public education is lowering. And that's a problem because most of that money then is going into advertising for the lottery and prizes for the lottery. It's not a very transparent way to fund public education. There are a lot of questions about it. And you have to go back to the origins of why people opposed the lottery in the first place. It was the opposition to the lottery was a strange marriage of groups of social conservatives who had sort of moral concerns with gambling and the lottery in the first place, and then sort of far left progressives who thought that a lottery system, particularly put out by the government, would simply cater to poor people and prey on poor people in hopes that they would hit it big.
Well, and Donald, you talk about this debate taking place in the early 2000s. We saw that here not that long ago with the addition of electronic sports betting. That came online here a couple of years ago in North Carolina. And then, of course, some major debates in the General Assembly over the couple of past legislative cycles over bringing casinos to the state outside of traditional Indian reservations, which already exist across North Carolina. Seems like that debate is not necessarily new.
No, it's not necessarily new. And you'll see the social conservative groups in North Carolina, like the North Carolina Family Policy Council and the North Carolina Values Coalition that the John Locke Foundation has worked with on other issues such as school choice, are still very much opposed to gambling in all of its forms and continue to fight it. And I think to a point they have a point. Let's set aside the free market views on that. It does change the culture of the state. Any type of gambling does. And casinos in particular, it's not just a casino. You go in, you pull a slot machine, and you walk back out. It is a whole establishment of shows and restaurants and all that. And people view them as economic booms, but the money goes into the casino and it stays within the casino. It very rarely trickles out to the community. The free market argument is if we're going to have gambling, whether that's a lottery or casinos or whatever, then let's have a lottery. Let's don't have a government-run lottery. Let's sort of let people do lotteries their own, let the private market take its own risks, because there is sort of a thing where the government is advertising to people in hopes, and the people respond to it in hopes that they will hit it big, right? We know that the odds are small. They even tell you in the advertising, because they legally have to, that it is small. But nonetheless, the rest of the ad is big about mega millions and it's gold and castles, and that's all the advertising. And then we're told that the money, even if you don't win, you should feel fine about it because it goes to public education. And it's not clear that all that money is necessarily going to education. We are putting about $1 billion a year into public education based on the lottery. But if we're going to basically tax people through government programs, through government lottery programs, right? then we may as well be more transparent about how we're funding it and talk about that through a regular process through the legislature rather than relying on, you know, somebody hoping that they can have better luck in their life.
And I think you talk about that situation again, right in the name, the North Carolina Education Lottery. You go into most bars and restaurants across North Carolina, you may see a little screen in the corner running the Keno machine, any gas station or convenience store. God forbid, Donald, you try and watch any sort of college or pro football, you'll be laden with these North Carolina Education Lottery ads. And in this auditor's report, revenues haven't just slowly trickled up. They have been booming across the state of North Carolina. I think most people would assume, you and me included, well, that means more money for education. But as you noted, that's not happening. And in some cases, those trends are even going downwards as it relates to the proportionality of that funding.
It is. It is. You know, the proportion is going down, and in some cases, you know, in the latest cases, year over year, the amount of money has gone down. Now we're still talking about over $1 billion, and if the legislature wanted to replace that now, they would have to find $1 billion within the budget. And honestly, I think there's enough government waste in North Carolina that the legislature could find it, right? But that's sort of the squeeze that we put legislators in, is they hear $1 billion is coming in non-tax revenue through the lottery to go to public education. And so they're making trade-offs in other places. And that's not a good way to continue to govern, that they're going to assume the lottery revenue is going to come in just based off of people playing the odds. It's not a good way to govern. It's not a good way to try to model what's going to happen economically and how government revenues are going to come in. It should go through a regular tax and spend process and not literal gamesmanship.
We've got this copy of this auditor's report. You can get those details over at carolinajournal.com. Donald, I guess my question for you is more of kind of a political atmosphere question. Where do we go from here? State Auditor Dave Bullock has shined a lot of spotlights on a lot of different issues over his last 12 months in office, the education lottery being one of the most recent examples that we're talking about this morning. Lawmakers are expected to be back in Raleigh over the next couple of months as the short session begins. Is there an appetite to maybe rein in the education lottery? Where do you kind of see the, no pun intended, chips falling on all of this?
First, I want to give kudos to Auditor Bullock. It's nice to see a state auditor actually auditing and doing things and shining some light on what are these government programs actually doing. And I'm glad he finally did this. You know, I think it's clear my preference and the John Locke Foundation's preference would be to do away with the lottery altogether and then go to a regular, you know, appropriations process through the state legislature, which is, I think, what the state constitution intended. But barring that, I think, you know, the time is absolutely right for Republicans in the General Assembly, and I'm sure that a lot of Democrats would sign on to this too, is to put some transparency measures on how much is this revenue, what's it going towards, what's it going to pay for, what school systems does it go to, how do the school systems use it. We need some transparency reforms on this lottery revenue. And at the very least, I think that's reasonable, and the time is very ripe in this legislative short session.
I'm not saying my opinion whether I'm for or against electronic sports betting, but I will say this, Donald, when they set that process up and that debate was going on, to their credit, lawmakers did lay out very explicitly, here are the 13 universities that can get X amount of dollars a year. The rest of the money goes into this fund. They did seem to, I don't know if they learned some lessons from the setup of the education lottery, but they were very explicit as to where this money is going to go. If there's extra money, if more and more people are betting on college football or other sorts of pro sports, this is where the excess goes. They seem to at least handle that in the right way.
You know, and I agree. And I think that, you know, even though the lottery came first, that is a great example of how guardrails can be put on these types of programs to at least provide some transparency and not let it run away. You know, at one point, there were several, you know, television and radio executives, not meaning to offend anybody on the program or listening to the program, but when you have people who are going to spend the advertising dollars determining what the advertising budget is going to be for the lottery, that's a little strange.
No question about that. We've got continued coverage of this over on our website, carolinajournal.com. You can read the full report from the state auditor's office. You can also check out the opinion piece from our guest, Donald Bryson. The headline there, Revisiting the NC Education Lottery's Promise. We appreciate the insight and information this morning. The president and CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Donald Bryson, joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 544 on Charlotte's FM News Talk, 107.9 FM, WBT. We'll head back to the traffic center, get a look at the Tuesday morning roads with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Nick. Near the state.
Good morning again. It's 5:49. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on Charlotte's FM News Talk 107.9 FM WBT. Throughout the rest of the year, we will be diving into a variety of different stories and relevant facts and information as it pertains to North Carolina's excised role in the assigning of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Of course, you've seen many probably television commercials and ads for America 250. That is what is going to be taking place later this year in North Carolina. One of the major dates will be March 15th, 2031. Yes, that is still a couple of years away, but that is the 250th anniversary of the 1781 Battle of the Guilford Courthouse. Thomas Sobel, who is a supervisory park ranger at the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park, said that the significance of the Continental Army's standoff under then-time Major General Nathan Greene, who was the second in command to George Washington and was responsible for overseeing the southern region, has often gone underappreciated. Part of the reason why is the fight lasted only 2.5 hours. However, it did prove to be a pivotal victory for the U.S., resulting in a 28% casualty rate for British forces that were already severely depleted. According to Sobel in his conversation with the Carolina Journal, he said while a lot more has to go wrong in Virginia before the Treaty of Paris would effectively end the war, the shift in momentum marks a psychological turning point in the war, noting that this is the beginning of the end. Following the brief but bloody encounter near what would later become Greensboro, North Carolina, basically abandoned the strategy of conquering for the and chasing the American army around and not giving loyalists any safety or control. With Thomas Sobel adding, he's no longer winning hearts and minds, he's just chasing around the American army. Only time will tell if the Guilford Courthouse may someday assume a place among battles like Trenton or Yorktown, some that you are probably very familiar with. However, historians do plan to use the occasion of the semi-quincentennial to unveil many of the stories and perspectives from the war that may otherwise have been lost to the ages. According to information, researchers from the National Park Service have been working in conjunction with the National Archives to digitize and in some cases even re-examine historical documents and other pieces of information from that era that continues to reveal shocking information. Overall, about 2,000 of the nearly 83,000 digitized records actually relate to the Guilford Courthouse, according to Sobel. He said in the course of the last year and a half, we've recruited over 1,000 volunteers from across the country. To combine, they've served more than 17,000 volunteer hours, transcribing thousands of pages of documents, undercovering stories, not only telling us more about the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, but really telling us more about what these veterans did through the Revolutionary War experience. What other battles did they fight in? What was life like in Piedmont, North Carolina, day to day? As it did during the battle of the 225th anniversary, the National Park Service plans to revamp its educational signage and infrastructure over the next few years to reflect more contemporary scholarship and sensibility. The result will be a, quote, more complex and more complete version than just what officers between the British and Continental armies wrote back and forth after the battle or how they communicated between themselves during their political leadership. With Sobel adding, I think there's a lot to understand of the Revolutionary War is more top-down. You'll learn about George Washington, you'll learn about Nathaniel Greens, but you don't hear about is the military men in ranks. In some cases, the new research may paint a grittier, less sanitized account of actually what happened, helping to humanize, in some cases, the conflict, one of many that took place here across North Carolina. One pensioner recounted that his widowed mother's home was burned and she was dragged out of the house by British militia. That man would go on to capture two of those that he believed to be responsible. One of them was executed after a trial legally because he was an enemy of the combatant. That man, reflecting back on those actions in his 80s, offered no remorse about what transpired in the fog of war, saying that he understands that this sounds very brutal, but noted and told recounters at the time, if you had been alive and shared the experiences that he had during the Revolutionary War, you would understand why he didn't show any regret for the actions or the results of that firefight. Considering the park's educational mission, a commemoration of war will also include some components with more family-friendly emphasis, less nitty-gritty, less brutal detail there. According to the state's America 250 Planning Commission, which is coordinated through the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Guilford Courthouse launched an inaugural fall festival last October, complete with colonial games, music, and historical interpretations. The statewide site offers a wide array of information and resources for planning events and getting involved with North Carolina's semi-quincentennial celebration, including an informational blog that highlights historical facts about various regions and local traditions. Guilford Courthouse will kick off the 2026 festivities as its first ever Descendant Symposium begins. That will start on March the 14th of this year. It will host a panel discussion with 5 participants who will share their extensive research and insight into their ancestors' wartime experiences. As is the case on non-anniversary years, the park will also continue to partner with private groups like the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution to coordinate big events for the March 15th anniversary of the battle and its annual July the 4th celebration. In July, the Son of the American Revolution have planned a 6-day national congressional event at the Greensboro Curry Convention Center, complete with tours of historic sites as well as some grave marking ceremonies as well. The culmination of the Guilford Courthouse events on the actual 250th anniversary, which again won't be until 2031, is still very much in the planning phases as we've got multiple years to go there. However, Thomas Sobel was confident enough based on historic precedent to make a few predictions, noting he would suspect a very large turnout with a major anniversary year like that. Meanwhile, he and his team of rangers remain focused on ensuring that visitors can enjoy the park's unique educational opportunities and natural beauty, not just on special occasions, but throughout the entire year. We will continue our coverage of America 250. You can read more about the Battle of Guilford Courthouse over on our website this morning at carolinajournal.com. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on Charlotte's FM News Talk, 107.9 FM, WBT.